Hello, welcome to the channel. In this video, we're going to cover everything about controllers on the Anbernic RG35XX. Part 1 goes over the equipment you're going to need, mostly hubs and adapters. Part 2, we're going to cover the actual setup for one controller. Part 3, 2 players. Now, Part 3, this is the killer feature of this device. 2 players, even the manufacturer doesn't advertise this 2-player feature, and I've never heard it mentioned in any comparison with the Mio. But I gotta say, 2-player, HDMI into the TV, you've got a full retro console experience, and the whole thing can fit into a tiny bag. You can bring it to a friend's house. It's pretty impressive. In part 4, we're gonna cover what works, which we've got hubs, we've got controllers. These are things that should be compatible with the device. Part 5, what doesn't work. Now, in this last part, I'm going to go over some controllers that don't work. We know the Switch Pro controller doesn't work, I'll just tell you now. Also, some hubs that probably won't work. I'm also going to go into my attempts to get 3 and 4 players working. Now, I believe this should work and will work in the future, but for some reason it just doesn't work right now. That's it for the intro, and let's start the show. Part 1 of this video, we're going to cover the equipment. You can see on the right, I have a photograph of everything you'll need. Really, there's only 2 very important things. First is this USB-C OTG cable, or on-the-go cable. And if we zoom in here, you'll be able to see the top part is a regular USB-C connector. This is going to plug into the console. On the bottom, on the left in this video, is the power connector. That's also a USB-C connector. And on the right, you can see it's a regular USB-A, or full-size USB connector. That's where we're going to plug in the controller. Speaking of controllers, that's the next part. You're going to need a USB controller, preferably Xbox compatible. Now, I say that because we know Xbox compatible or X input, a lot of times you'll see it listed. This X input, we know it works. It's a fairly widely adapted standard, and it just works. All the buttons are mapped to the same spots. It's great. I have a few generic controllers, older controllers, that use, I think, D input, and while those will work, they require a lot of remapping. And other controllers, for instance, I have a Switch controller, doesn't recognize the Switch Pro controller, and there's probably a bunch of other controllers that it doesn't work, but we do know it works with Xbox compatible or X input. So if you, like me, have an 8-bit Duke controller, make sure you put it into X input or Xbox mode, Xbox compatible. The other things you can see in the picture, obviously the device itself, RG35XX, that's up there at the top. And towards the bottom, I've got a regular USB power adapter. The regular wall plug and the USB charger that came with it. To enable controller support, we first need to go to the MISC or MISC partition on your first SD card. Now, this will be the small, usually the first partition on the SD card. And I have the README up there. You can see it says to create a wait for USB file. We're going to right-click, create a new text file. And you can see here the text extension isn't shown. To show extensions, we need to go to the top of the window, select View, and then check File Name Extensions. Now we can see the .txt extension. And we need to rename this file. So go ahead, copy wait for USB from the README. We're going to paste it over the name of the file. No extension on wait for USB. It's just wait for USB. We're going to get a warning about changing the extension. That's okay. Just go ahead, click OK, And we're all set. Now for the physical setup. And once you know how everything hooks up, it's actually pretty easy to connect. We're going to go ahead. First, we've got the power cord. I'm going to plug that into the wall and run the power cord over to the OTG cable or the OmniGo cable. I'm going to go ahead, plug it into the power connector. You can see the little lightning bolt. Next, I'm going to plug in my controller. You can see it's full-size USB-A connector there. Plug that in. Then we're going to go ahead, plug that into the Ambernic. But of course, shouldn't do it while it's turned on. Controller's not recognized. Yeah, I should have had the console turned off when I did this, but that's fine. We're going to power it off. Then go ahead, power it back on. Once it comes back up, we should be all set. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward a little bit. There we go, powered back on, and you can see the controller's recognized. We're going to go ahead, launch, I don't know, Alfred Chicken. There we go. USB controllers working on the console, no problems. One thing to note, you can't hit the menu shortcuts or menu button on the controller. You've got to hit the menu button on the actual console. Right now, there's no way to map that menu button to the controller, so you still need access to the console. Now, the only additional equipment you need for two-player besides another controller, although technically you don't need another controller, I'll get into that way later, but you're going to need a USB hub. Now, this pictured is just an Anchor brand USB hub, 4-port, USB-A on both ends. I've tried some USB-C hubs and they haven't worked. Some people online say they have a USB hub works. I imagine it all depends on what type you get and how it connects to the device. But generally speaking, a USB-A hub will be fine. Now, this is a USB 3.0 hub, but you could use a USB 2.0 hub. It's not going to be a problem. You're not going to have any latency issues on a 2.0 hub. It'll be fine. Now we're going to cut to the actual two-player setup. You can see I've got my 4-port USB hub plugged into the device, the Ambernic RG35XX. We're going to go ahead and plug in the two controllers. Once I take care of that cord, trying to keep it neat so it doesn't just look like a mess of wires, and plug it in the right way. There we go. Both controllers are plugged in. You can see the Xbox controller is blinking. That's fine. It's just because there's power going to it. Power up the device. We're going to cut to it already launched. I'm going to go ahead into the RetroArch menu. Here we want to go to Settings and then Input. Maximum users, we're going to hit the right arrow over to 2. We could also click on this and select 2 from this list, 2 players. And then all the way at the bottom is the port controls, or if you go up, all loops around, port 1. We're going to go ahead and check the port 1 controls. Those should actually be all set. Generic Xmod, that's this one here, the GameStop one. And then go back, port 2 controls, device index. This we change to the other controller. Here it's showing up as Microsoft Xbox 360 pad. That's actually the 8-bit Duke controller. And there we have it. Should be all set. We're going to go ahead, go back, and if we want to save it, go to Configuration File, Save Current Configuration. That keeps it so next time if you restart your system, it'll save that 2-player setup. Quit RetroArch. I'm going to go into console. Let's load a simple 2-player game. I already have Gauntlet 2 in progress, so let's just jump to that. And There we have it. You can see I'm moving around. That's player 1. That's player 2. And there we go. For me, 2-player is the reason you even bother with controllers. I mean, 1 player on a TV, that's all well and good, but the fact that you can get 2 players on this console means now you have fun. I mean, you could bring this over to somebody's house. This whole thing can fit in a little bag and hook it up to the TV. Old school 2-player action in some cool retro games. I'm going to go ahead, hit menu to exit, and let's see you on the other side. Now, before I get to the final parts of this video, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about something I kind of stumbled upon, which is 2 players with only 1 controller, also known as Sega Nomad style. Now, I call it Sega Nomad because the Sega Nomad could actually do something very similar to this device. So the Sega Nomad played full Sega Genesis games even though it was a portable device. And like the Ambernick, you could plug it into a TV. Plus, on the bottom, you could plug in a full Genesis controller. However, it only worked for player 2. I remember taking this with me on the school bus, and 2 people could play Mortal Kombat or any other 2-player game for that matter by plugging in the player 2 controller and handing the controller to the person on the bus seat behind me. That way he could kind of peer over the seat and still see the screen. You can also get away with 2 players on the TV with the 1 console, and just like with the Nomad, you got to be really careful because a small bump is going to disconnect everything. But anyway, enough about the Nomad. Let's talk about how to set this up on the RG35XX. Now we're going to cut over to a 1 controller setup. I'm going to go ahead, start Crash Team Racing, and you can see once the game loads that it's not mapped correctly. And you can see here the mapping is all messed up. I'm controlling player 1 with both the console and the controller. You might see something different because of whether you've configured anything before, but you can see it's not working. So menu X, I'm going to go back to the main menu, go to input. I'm going to go to the bottom where the port 1 and port 2 controls are, and since we want port 2 to be the controller, I'm going to go ahead, device index, and change that to the controller, Microsoft Xbox 360 pad. I'm going to go back, go to port 1, and change this to be NA. It can actually be any of these NA or non-applicable devices. It doesn't matter which one, as long as there's no controller assigned. I guess this console just defaults. If there's nothing assigned, it's using the built-in controls. And there you go. I'm going to go back to the main menu, into the quick menu, resume game. And you can see I'm controlling player 1 with the console, and I'm controlling player 2 with the plugged-in controller. And I'm going to fast forward to the start of a game. You can see I'm able to drive around with player 1 with the built-in controls and drive around with player 2 with the separate controls. And there you have it. It might not be the most useful or practical configuration, but it's cool that the device is flexible enough to work this way. Now, let's talk about what works. Let's take a little time to show some controllers, some hubs, some things that we know do work on this system. But first, I'm going to take a minute to show another thing that works, which is analog in PlayStation 1 games. Now to show analog working, I've loaded up a PlayStation 1 game that supports it, Crash Team Racing. I'm going to go to menu X. I'm going to go to the controls section. And since I'm working on port 2, I'm going to that. We change it to DualShock. See that device type? Change it to DualShock. I'm doing this on port 2. If you were using port 1, that's what you would change to DualShock. But if we go back into the game, you can see player 2. Once I move my hand, you'll be able to see. There you go. See, joystick is controlling the gameplay now. So, analog works once you enable DualShock. Here is the USB-C OTG cable I got. You can see it's Mogood brand or Mogood. I don't know how to pronounce that, but I'm betting that any USB-C OTG adapter that looks like this is going to work. It's pretty simple and straightforward. So USB-C OTG cables, those work. Next, we've got our standard 4-port USB hub. This is an Anker brand. I've had plenty of Anker stuff and can't go wrong. Although any USB hub that's USB-A is probably going to work. I found a 3-port USB hub with Ethernet. It's another Anker brand device. Tried it. Guess what? Worked. No problem. So, didn't test the Ethernet. I don't think there's anything to test it on, but I'm willing to bet that once the OS catches up to Ethernet, it'll work too. I wanted to confirm that USB 2.0 hubs would work, so I actually found an old 7-port powered USB hub, Staples brand. Apparently Staples threw their name on it, but old USB 2.0 hub worked no problem. One thing to note is the powered hub would be powering the controllers. None of that power would be going into the Ambernic. I also found this odd USB-C, USB-A adapter. Doesn't even have a brand, but it did work. This has a card reader built into it. I didn't try that, but it did work to get a controller connected, so hey. $8BitDo controller works no problem. Just got to remember to put it in Xbox mode or X input mode. I gotta say, 8BitDo, this is my first 8BitDo controller and it works great. Plus, look at it, it's got that classic PlayStation type dual analog style. Great controller, works no problem. Xbox mode. Speaking of Xbox, we have a generic Xbox 360 controller. The Xbox 360 is when Microsoft started standardizing USB controllers, and a lot of manufacturers jumped on board. So this GameStop Xbox 360 controller, plug it in, works, all the buttons are mapped correctly, it's great. Now this one I had to include. Tried an old PSX to USB adapter, and wouldn't you know, it worked. So this is a way to get actual PlayStation or PlayStation 2 controllers on this system. Now, it didn't recognize all the buttons in the right mapping, probably because it's some old D input or some weird computer standard, but it did recognize it, it did function. So it is possible to make it work, although good luck finding these things. It's a Radio Shack brand, and I don't think they exist anymore. Finally, I'm going to take a minute to talk about what doesn't work, and spoiler alert, it's a couple of USB-C hubs. So first, we've got this USB-C hub. It's a Totu brand, I don't know, some whatever you get off Amazon. Standard fare of a big USB-C port. It's got two USB 2s, two USB 3s. It's got HDMI, VGA, Ethernet, all these features, and you know what it doesn't do? Work on the Ambernic. Doesn't let it charge through it, doesn't recognize controllers, doesn't work. But that last port was pretty big. Let's go to a smaller USB-C hub, and same thing, doesn't work. You know, this one's slightly smaller, only 3 ports, HDMI, Ethernet, you know, still doesn't work. And I just had to be sure, however, Nintendo Switch dock doesn't work. I have this USB-C extension cable that let me actually plug it in to the Switch dock, but I gotta tell you, didn't work, didn't charge, didn't recognize anything plugged into USB, so there's that. Interestingly enough, the Nintendo Switch Pro controller does not work. And I say interesting because RetroArch actually does see the Nintendo Switch Pro controller. You can map it to a port. It just doesn't work. You know, press the buttons, nothing happens. I don't know. And the last thing I'm going to cover is what should work but currently doesn't. And that's 3 to 4 players. Now, I'm going to have some playing in the background, me trying to get this to work. However, I really tried. I went through all the steps, but it just wouldn't work. And I'm willing to bet there's a line of code somewhere, or just, you know, some option that is buried in the programming of the operating system. I'm pretty sure that this should work and will work in the future, but right now it doesn't. You can even see here, I go in, you can see all 3 controllers, so it can recognize all of them, and I can map the 3rd controller to, you know, port 3, but it still doesn't recognize any input, you know? The game doesn't see it. And I started out Gauntlet 2, you know, Gauntlet 2 is a classic 4-player Nintendo game. Just trying to get that to work. I was even looking to see if the core, you know, the RetroArch core had some kind of setting somewhere in there for multi-tap, or what was it called on the Nintendo? Fourscore, I think it was called, the Nintendo Fourscore, to enable 4 players, but I didn't see any options. It didn't help. Here you can see I'm loading up Gauntlet. It doesn't matter. Player 1, no problem. Player 2, no problem. Player 3, you see it's not picking a character, you know, usually that little yellow wizard would be changing. None of that. Here you can see I actually swap what controller is mapped to ports 2 and 3, swapping basically the GameStop Xbox with the 8-bit do, and sure enough the 8-bit do now works for player 2. So clearly both controllers are functioning at the same time, it's just no player 3 for some reason. Here we're going to switch to PlayStation. We're going to load up Crash Team Racing. Crash Team Racing is a good example because it supports the multi-tap. Lets you play up to 4 players. We're going to go into the settings, menu X. First, I'm just going to make sure that the controls are, everything is mapped to the right port. You know, port 1 is on 1. 2 is on 2, 3 is on 3. Okay, that's all good. Then we're going to go back, go to the core options. I'm going to go to input. And right there, multi-tap, we'll turn that on. Port 1's fine. Port 1 is now the multi-tap. Now it says restart, so we're going to have to restart the whole game. And since we're going to have to restart it, I want to make sure to save it. So we're going to save those game options. That way when we restart the game, it saves the multi-tap enabled, all that. So I'm going to go out. So you can see that the multi-tap isn't recognized. It's still only showing 2 players. I'm going to go ahead, click restart. Well, actually close content. Get out of RetroArch. Load up Crash Team Racing again. Okay, that's still not recognizing the multi-tap. I think I gotta restart the whole game. And the restart's freezing, so let's skip ahead. Now I restarted the game by pressing start, and you can see it recognizes the multi-tap. So turning on the multi-tap is seen in the game. It now lets you do 3 players or 4 players. However, it still doesn't recognize any inputs from player 3. Even though we've mapped player 3's controller, it just doesn't work. I'm pretty sure that they'll be able to fix this or enable it. It's probably fairly simple. I imagine that nobody else has really asked for 3 or 4 players on this thing yet, so I'm hoping it'll be turned on eventually. And that about wraps it up for controllers. Hopefully that gives you everything you need to know about setting up controllers on the old RG35XX. And hey, thanks for watching. Click those buttons and see you next time.